Hello, dear friends. I'm Samuel Moore, and welcome to Talking Music, the show where you get to enjoy long-form discussions with superb and fascinating musicians. My brilliant guest today is the guitarist and composer Will McNicol. Will, welcome to Talking Music.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
The pleasure's all mine, my friend. Now, Will, you and I have known each other for some time, but for those watching and listening who aren't yet familiar with you and your work, perhaps you could start by giving us a brief overview of who you are and what's been your journey through life that has led you to be sitting here today.
Right. Well, it's a big question, isn't it? My journey through life. Let's do the truncated version. So, I was born in Scotland and started playing guitar when I was 6 years old at school. It started off classical and went through the grade system very diligently. Started composing, I guess, when I was in my early teens, off the back of seeing some very inspiring concerts, which I'm sure we'll talk about more as the interview continues. And it was that moment when I started composing where music took on a completely different meaning for me. And it, as I kind of continued down that route, it became a bigger and bigger part of my life. And whilst I continued my classical studies, I started performing more and recording more, and just gradually, slowly but surely, becoming, I guess, a professional musician. Even though there wasn't a time in my life where I decided to press a button and become one, it almost just happened quite organically. And I was like, oh, right, I guess I'm a professional musician now. And we met as part of that kind of journey as a professional musician. I think we first met at the IGF London Guitar Summit over at King's Place a few years back. And we've obviously done some playing together as well. And you very kindly invited me to be part of this series of yours. So that's the whistle-stop tour through the highlights of how we end up here today.
Well, magnificent. And you, unlike any interview I've done, you've literally gone right up to the moment we hit record on this. So I appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, there's so much I'd like to unpack there, Will. So maybe a good place to start. You mentioned quite a lot of things, but I'd like to hear about some of your early influences. You mentioned that there were some really inspirational performances you went to see. Could you unpack those a little bit for us?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So one that always sticks out in my memory is the first time that I saw the Italian acoustic guitarist Antonio Forcioni perform. I guess I would have been in my early teens, somewhere around about 14 years old. Him and his quartet were playing at another school, kind of relatively local to where we were, and my guitar tutor, Maurice Alban, suggested that it would be a nice one to go to, and my parents took me along. And at that time, my knowledge of guitar was quite classically based, and I was also getting quite drawn towards blues playing on the electric as well, your Stevie Ray Vaughans and Eric Claptons of the world. But this concert that Antonio and his quartet gave opened my eyes and ears to an entirely different realm, and an entirely different way of thinking about how the guitar can be played, in what contexts it can be played, the creative element around music. Because up until that point, I had been learning other people's music and enjoying it. But this was a concert where I was like, oh, wow, here's someone who has their own personality and their own signature that they're putting into everything that they do on stage. They're not just playing someone else's pieces. They have created their own pieces, which are very, very unique. And it was so exciting for me, that kind of stage of my musical development in life, to hear that. The quartet was also a wonderful thing, because it was Antonio on steel string acoustic guitar and nylon string acoustic guitar. I would switch between the two, as he often does. He was teamed up with another classical and Spanish guitarist called Giorgio Cerci. I'm not sure if you know him, but he's fantastic. And they had Jenny Adajayan on cello, Nigerian cellist, and Adriano Adewale on percussion from Brazil. So, it was a true definition of like a world music quartet, and that was something that I was really struck by with Antonio's playing. He was grabbing all these influences from all over the world, bringing them together, both in his compositions, but also in the musicians that he was working with, and the way they sparked off one another, and the way he was using his guitar to create these incredible textures, sounds, melodies, rhythms, all of the extended techniques such as percussive work, tapping, all of that stuff. So as a 14-year-old it was totally green to it, it absolutely blew my mind. And I was like, all right, here we go. This has really grabbed me. I would love to be able to get in on this somehow. So that performance for me was a real turning point that opened my kind of musical world to so many different influences. And there was that moment where I pleaded with my parents to get me a steel string acoustic guitar so I could start trying to recreate some of the things that I saw Antonio do, whether it be a slap harmonic here, a rhythmic groove there, trying to bring in some influences that I heard him bringing into the music from like Africa, and just, the whole thing. It would just like this open up this kind of Pandora's box of musical ideas. So that's a big one for me for sure.
And since then, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Antonio there, because I know in recent years you've actually worked with Antonio in a professional context. So to have gone kind of full circle from initially being an admiring fan to actually being a working professional alongside him, that must have been quite an experience.
It was quite an experience, and it was quite surreal, really. The first time I worked with him, I should say, subsequently to that concert of Antonio, I saw him countless times since then in my teenage years, growing up. So I really had quite a kind of a good knowledge of his music. But then it was when I was in my, I think, early 20s, when I got contacted by the IGF, which is that International Guitar Foundation, who run events all over the country. But one of them was the Guitar Summit in London, where they would get a player, a very experienced player, and team them up with a tutor, basically, and they would kind of create a course that people would sign up. I don't know that you were there. I can't quite remember if that was the first year that I'd done with Antonio or the second, but I got an email from the IGF saying, "Hey, Will, would you like to work on our Guitar Summit?" Which is what we do. We team up a tutor with a player and create a course, and etc. The player in question is Antonio Forcioni, and for me, like, getting that email was just ridiculous. I mean, it was just one of those things where you just think, "Oh, okay, cool." So I kind of replied saying, the kind of classic feigned kind of cool manner, like, "Oh, I'll just check the diary. I'll see if I can squeeze it in." In the meantime, as you can imagine, just like, deleting everything from my calendar, making the space, and I kind of made it happen. And Antonio and I collaborated on that course, and it was a very surreal, very exciting thing, because on the one hand, I was a massive fan of his music, and it had been a big influence of mine growing up. But on the other hand, I was having to, I was there to do a job. So when he picked me up from the tube station, we went to his house to chat about the course and what we would include and everything else. I was obviously surrounded by all of these instruments that I'd seen him perform over many, many years, and it was awesome, fantastic. It was a lovely, lovely experience, and a really nice way of working with Antonio and getting an even deeper understanding of his music. Part of the job was transcribing his stuff, and that was a really fascinating process as well, and one that I've continued with him since then. And we've just become firm friends since then. We've obviously done other workshops together. We've been on the same bills at various festivals together. And yeah, he's a wonderful musician, and a good friend now, which is it's lovely. Really, really nice.
Well, thank you for sharing that story with us. And it kind of ties in with how you and I know each other, because I think it was 2015 that year, if memory serves.
Oh, yes, that's right.
And I when you were talking then, that was exactly my experience, because I got a similar email about working with Juan Martin, the great
Yes, that was
guitarist. Much like yourself, I tried to play it cool whilst clearing my entire diary. And I'm very glad I did, because not only was that a great experience, but it meant I got to meet you for the first time and see you perform and get to know you. And this kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you, Will, because since that first meeting, I've been a huge fan of your work. I'm going to embarrass you a little bit now. I actually have your album on, well, quite a few of your albums, more than pretty much any other artist. I love
Oh,
your
man. Oh,
I
that's very kind.
absolutely love
Thanks,
it.
man.
Oh, it's just saying it how it is, my friend.
Mhm.
Now, this is something that I've been puzzling over for a long time listening to your music because you kind of alluded to this in your musical journey. You started out as a classical player, you then discovered this whole world of sounds, but you still play both nylon string and steel string. And there are so many influences in what you do. I can hear your classical influences, I can hear the kind of percussive acoustic influences, I can hear blues, I can hear jazz. The point I'm getting at, my friend, is this. It's actually quite hard to pin you down in terms of what you do.
Mhm.
So let's hear it in your own words. How would you describe your music? What genre do you play?
It's such a good question, and one that has been a big sticking point throughout my career, to be honest. And I've had meetings with publishing companies, for example, about my music, and we've had this conversation. They're like, "We like what you do, Will, but we need to put you somewhere. Like, in order for us to do our job, we need to put you somewhere, and we don't know where to put you." And my response to that back then was like, "Yes, I'm terribly sorry about that. I don't really know where to put myself either." Um, I never really set out to be a particular musician of a particular genre. Everything about my musical journey has been this kind of gradual evolution, bringing in these kind of different influences. So I guess it's one of those things where so many things have gone into the pot. Yes, the classical thing has gone into the pot. South American composers, they've gone into the pot. I love playing blues, but I wouldn't describe myself as a blues guitarist. If someone wants to learn the blues, don't come to me. But I still love it. And the contemporary steel string thing, I was big into the percussive side for a while when I first started. Then I've moved away from that a little bit. So what you end up with, and I think I've become more comfortable in this kind of in my own musical identity in the last few years, in the sense that I'm a very melody driven fingerstyle guitarist, and I think that if you had to describe me as anything, you could use that word fingerstyle, which is an interesting word because obviously it's technically descriptive, but is often used as a kind of genre within this realm. Fingerstyle, because that is true, but it's not on the percussive side, really, certainly not anymore. um, but it is very melody driven. So to kind of as a kind of catch-all a catch-all term, I would say a melody-driven fingerstyle guitarist is about as good as you're going to get. Sadly, that's not really a pigeonhole where a publishing company can put me. Um, so words that often get floated around, obviously, acoustic, yes, of course, but that's very broad. Um, and I skirt around those kind of realms of folk and jazz, as you mentioned, but I'm neither a folk guitarist nor a jazz guitarist. But I am within those realms as well because I've played folk festivals and I've folk gigs and folk clubs, and I've played jazz clubs and I've played jazz kind of gigs. But I'm like 1 foot in a little bit, like just on the edge of those worlds. But I would never be described as a folk player, and I would never be described as a jazz player. So yeah, it's a bit of a sticking point, Samuel. I'm sorry I haven't been particularly brief or specific there, but it's a challenge and one that I think at the moment, if we're going to have to pick something, melody-driven fingerstyle acoustic guitarist is probably about as good as you're going to get.
Well, I think that's a really good way of putting it, and I like how you unpacked that as well. I like how we went into a lot of detail as to how you've come to that, and I think this leads me quite nicely to where I'd like to steer the conversation because I'm not going to try to describe what genre I think you play because I think you've already done that pretty well yourself. But if I
Mm-hmm.
had to describe you as a musician with one word, I think I'd have to put my finger on the word composition.
Mm-hmm.
You clearly love to compose your own material and have your own voice. What is it about composition that so interests you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And composition for me, I mean, the process I find to be utterly addictive. And that's the thing that I found having seen Antonio, that kind of lit that fire, and that kind of process of discovering something new and following a path and going off on tangents and all of that process. I just loved it. I've never experienced a feeling like the feeling that I get when I'm composing, when I'm in the middle of composing a piece, and the excitement I get from chasing these musical ideas and trying to find where they're going, trying to pin them down, trying to flesh them out, trying to develop them. It's deeply, deeply gratifying, and it's something that connected with me. It did. It connected with me fairly early on. To be honest, I didn't have to work particularly hard to feel a connection from the process of composing. And over many years, the thing that I've enjoyed is refining that process, and kind of, I suppose, digging into what I think my voice is on the instrument, having the confidence to be like, this is my work, this is a representation of myself in music, and having the confidence to be cool with that, and not necessarily going, oh, is this okay, I hope this is okay. It's like, it doesn't matter, it is mine. And I think that was quite a nice tonic from having gone through the classical process and loving that, and still loving that, and learning other people's pieces, which are obviously magnificent. It's such a wonderful repertoire this instrument of ours has, and exploring these wonderful pieces is, again, deeply gratifying and very exciting, and interpreting them in your own way, again, very, very gratifying, making them your own. But I never really got the same buzz from that process as I did from composing my own music, because that really, when I was younger, when I first started, I felt a real sense of sense of ownership over this. No one could tell me how to do it. It wasn't like, if I was learning some Bach and someone would say, oh, you know what, you've got to phrase it in this way, or you've got to consider this musical element or whatever. It's all about, my own approach to it, and having ownership over the music I was creating. So that was definitely a big part of what attracted me to composition and why I've stuck with it for so long. Yeah.
There's some interesting things I'd like to unpack a little bit there. I mean, one thing that struck me, it kind of sounds that it chose you rather than you chose it to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And another thing I thought was interesting there, because you talked about kind of bringing your musical voice out. And I'd like to just riff on that a little bit, because I don't know how you feel about this. I kind of get the impression a lot of people have this kind of strange idea that you kind of go out searching for your musical voice, and it's kind of out there in the wilderness. And often I find it's kind of already in you, and you kind of have to give yourself permission for it to come out.
Yeah.
Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I think that would be really fair, actually. And it's certainly something that when I've been working with students on this idea of composition, that it is, having the confidence to kind of chase those ideas and bring it out of yourself, is a key part of what we would discuss. Because I think people sometimes put composition as on a bit of a pedestal, maybe, like it sounds quite lofty, doesn't it? But it shouldn't be. It should be. I think that composition and that creative process on the guitar has value at every step of the journey, no matter what stage you're at within your playing. It could be literally your first ever lesson, like the first time you picked up the guitar. The creative element of the playing could be in part of that. You don't have to reach this kind of particular level in order to go, yes, now I am good enough to compose. Like that isn't a thing. Like, you don't have to be good enough to compose. You just have to have the confidence to go, you know what, let's give this a try. Let's give this a go and just chase it and see what happens. And in fact, actually, I had a conversation with a student just the other day, actually, where he was interested in composition. He wasn't necessarily kind of in the kind of situation where he was like, I need to compose, or this is the reason I'm playing. But I was like, I'm interested in composition. I want to try it out. So he gave some ideas a try, but he decided ultimately that that wasn't actually what he wanted to pursue, and that's also totally fine. Like, he was more interested in learning repertoire and building himself up as a player, and the composition thing, he might dabble in it, and try it out from time to time, but it wasn't part of his musical identity. But I really think it's incredibly valuable to at least explore it and see what it can bring to your playing. Because the other thing I'll just bring up as well is the other thing that I found really useful about composition in my own development as a guitarist is the fact that it allowed me to get better at things that I wouldn't have otherwise got better at. For example, I see Antonio, I see him doing some crazy kind of tapping stuff or like slap harmonics or whatever it might be. And I don't know how to do that. And I want to get better at it. So how do I get better at it? Well, I create a bit of music that uses it so I can get better at it. It's like almost like my very earliest compositions really were almost like short studies, like short exercises, like how to get better at a technique because I wanted to, but I was like, well, I don't have anything. I don't have that back then. It wasn't the wealth that it is now in terms of the ease of getting all of these scores and music from all these players. It was like, well, I have to do it myself. So I just create. So yeah, that was a big part of it for me as well.
Some really interesting points there, and it kind of leads me to the next question I wanted to ask you. So I liked how you said, some people composition might not be part of their musical identity, but for some it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk directly to those people for whom it is.
Mm-hmm.
I often hear students of music say things similar to this to me. I'd love to compose my own material, but I just don't know where to begin.
Mm.
Now, obviously the answer, if someone's working in a particular genre, the answer might be specific to that genre, but let's just unpack it in a kind of broad sense. What would you say to a student who said that to you?
Well, it's a great kind of question, isn't it? Because it's that kind of that thing that you would have as a writer, that kind of blank page. They kind of almost, there's so many possibilities. Like, where do you even begin? So having something to latch onto is not a bad idea, and choosing something just to get you started is not a bad idea, I don't think. And also being willing to start simple and start small, not thinking that the first piece of music you're going to be writing is going to be some epic concerto or something. It can be small, and it can be just a way of beginning that key word, isn't it? That process, like, and seeing if you're enjoying that process. So composition prompts can be quite helpful, so you could say something like, compose a 1 minute piece of music that helps develop your ability to play arpeggios on the guitar. So that gives you something to grab onto and go, okay, right, the page is no longer blank. We have a prompt, we have some kind of purpose for this piece. And that's quite a technical kind of starting point. Developing some element of technique, that could be a really useful thing to kind of start your process. It could be something a little bit more abstract. It could be, compose a short piece trying to conjure up the imagery of a sunrise, and you're thinking a little bit more as a composer in that regard, trying to get music to fit imagery, and that's something that I love working on. So I think in a pithy way, like in a kind of a smaller possible way, just picking something just to get you started. And it really, in many respects, it doesn't really matter what it is, because the thing that matters is the process and just getting yourself started. And I think some kind of prompt can be helpful. And you probably already have it in you somewhere. You probably think, I wish I could do this. All right, there we go. There's your starting point. Get better at that. Whatever it is, create something that makes you better at that. And that's been my story. I mean, there's infinite numbers of ways of starting it, but that I think is a nice way to go. And as you kind of continue down that route, that you can kind of start chasing other kind of areas within the process. I mean, I've spent a long time thinking about my composition process and the thinking processes I go through within it, and have created this system called the 4 hats, which I give to students who are wanting to kind of really dig into composition and understand a little bit about how I approach it. And the 4 hats system is kind of very briefly, it's the idea of keeping the process moving forward by occupying these different headspaces as you're creating music. So what are the 4 hats in this example? Well, you have the guitarist hat, you have the composer hat, the arranger hat, and the artist hat, right? And all of those 4 hats combine to create, the piece of music. And what I found is if I ever get stuck in a composition and I don't know where to go, all I need to do is take off one hat and put another one on, and we keep going. So, for example, as a guitarist, when you have the guitarist hat on, what you can call upon is the wealth of knowledge you have as a guitarist. People never give themselves enough credit to how much they actually end up knowing when they learn guitar. So many students come to me and say, I don't really know much theory. Is that a problem? Like, no, it's not a problem, but you know way more than you think you know. You just haven't actually thought about it in that way. Like, do you know a G chord? And it's like, yeah, I know G chord. Well, there we go. You know a G major chord. You know G major. That's some theory right there. Let's unpack that. So scales, chords, tunings, techniques, all of these wonderful things that make you a guitarist, that's the guitarist hat. So that's a really lovely resource that you can kind of like call upon in your composition process. Use the instrument to inspire. There's the composer hat, which is that thing we just touched on about being able to potentially kind of grab onto something and create music based on that. And for me, quite often it's to do with taking some imagery and putting music to that image. That's very much how I compose often. So I have a piece called Lighthouse, and no surprises there. I've tried to conjure up the imagery of a lighthouse, and that ability to take image and get musical ideas to fit with that imagery, that is part of that kind of composer idea. And there's obviously kind of techniques within that which can be really helpful to know, what kind of chords that would conjure up certain imagery, what kind of harmonies, what kind of melodies, what kind of structures, etc., etc. So that's the composer. Then the arranger is a really kind of fun one in the process for me, because the penny dropped at one point when I was composing and I was writing a chord sequence or whatever it might have been. And I created this piece of music on the guitar, and it existed in that very kind of specific place on the guitar. But then I realized that that music now can exist anywhere. It doesn't have to stay there. It could be given to a string quartet, it could be given to a pianist, and it could also be put into many, many other places on the instrument itself, on the guitar. So the arranger hat is where I can really dig into the idea. Once you have an idea and you've created a musical idea, where can you take that? How many different iterations can you rearrange that chord sequence? Where can you revoice it? Where can you put the melodies? Just in the same way as you could, arrange something for an orchestra. You're throwing these ideas around. So that's the arranger hat. And then finally, the artist hat, which is probably the most kind of tricky out of all of them. And that's to do with artistic intention. What are you actually trying to do here? What's the purpose of all of this? Sure, you've got some music on the guitar, you've got some nice chord voicings, you've got some imagery, but okay, so what now? So it's that confidence within you to make those artistic decisions. Like, this is the way I'm going, rather than go, if you have all of those ideas, when you have all those ideas, like, which direction do you take? Like, it's sometimes difficult to know, right? And having the confidence within your artistic self to go, that's the way to go. That's where the artist hat comes in. And that's very much how I approach my own composition process these days. It's kind of switching between those different headspaces to make sure the process keeps moving forward in an exciting way. And over many years, what I found really fascinating is how the importance of those hats kind of shifted around in my composition process. So when I first started, sorry, my dog there. When I first started, it was all about the guitarist. I was trying to show off a little bit too much. It was all very technique driven stuff. So the guitarist was right at the top of the priority pile, and the artist was right at the bottom. I didn't care about any of that kind of stuff. I wanted to be flash, flying around the fretboard, all that kind of stuff. Then over the years, those kind of different kind of headspaces, those different kind of ways of thinking have kind of aligned, and now they have much more of an equal footing with one another. So yeah, it's been interesting to reflect on that when I created that system. I'm very aware that I've just kind of really kind of gone off on one there, Samuel. I'm sorry about that, but that
No,
just
not
what we were
at,
on the subject of composition, so I thought I'd get through all of that.
not at all. There was some great material there. I want to just kind of tease out and summarize some of the things that you've said there. So, first things first, I think one of the most valuable things you just mentioned is what I would describe as people not aiming low enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think far too often people approach any big subject like composition and they aim way, way too high.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you've got to accept that it's an evolutionary process, and you will get better at it with time.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be Chopin right on day one.
Mm-hmm.
So I loved how you kind of put that right at the start. I think that was wonderful. And I love that process that you described, so that you can essentially look at the same object from many different angles.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're absolutely right. You can be a fantastic guitarist, but not a very good artist. and
Hmm.
be a great artist and not a very good guitarist and arranger, and so on and so forth. So I love how you talked about that through that process. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Great. I hope it made sense. I kind of just went full throttle there, but it's a topic I'm very well. I get quite excited about it. So it's a lovely thing. Composition, yeah, for sure.
That's marvelous. Well, I'd like to now do something I always love doing on Talking Music. I want to unpack in greater detail certain very specific aspects of your musicianship. Because I think, irrespective of what genre people watching and listening specialise in, or what style of music, or indeed what instrument they play, they could learn valuable lessons from things I think you're about to be able to unpack for us.
Hmm.
Let me start with this. One thing I've loved about your playing for many years is your willingness to experiment with different tunings on the guitar.
Hmm.
What is it about that side of the instrument that interests you so much?
Yeah, I think that the realm of alternate tunings is an interesting one because just in the basic sense, like as soon as you start changing the tuning of your instrument, it takes on a very different personality, I think. And from a point of view of the kind of the resonances of the strings, some of the things that you come to rely on in standard tuning are very different to the things that you rely on in, for example, an open tune like Dad Gad or an open chord like D major or G minor or whatever it might be. Yeah, and you can make the most of those tunings and what they bring to the guitar. And I found that a really interesting thing to explore. Also, the other thing is about these alternate tunings is that they force you to think about the instrument in a slightly different way. So if you've become very knowledgeable of standard tuning and you know your way around the fretboard with standard tuning, as soon as you start messing with that, you have to start again. And you kind of think, okay, well now I don't have my same reference points anymore. I don't have these nice kind of comfortable shapes that I've spent years kind of getting under the fingers. It all has to kind of you have to forget about that and kind of start again. And that's an interesting way to discover different sounds because it pushes you out of the comfort zones that you might find yourself in standard tuning and you rely upon. And then when you move into alternate tunings, yeah, you're going to have to think a little bit more about how you can get the sounds that you're wanting to get. So those were parts of the things that attracted me to kind of alternate tunings in the first place. And when I first started using them, it would be a case of maybe starting with the tuning first and creating music based around the tuning. But then I started creating music, and then the music would inform the tuning instead of the other way around. So you've got your classic alternate tunings that are very common: drop D, double drop D, dad gad, etc., etc. But you also have slightly more abstract alternate tunings, and I found myself exploring that because I would be, for example, creating a piece of music, and I thought to myself, I'm missing something here, and I can't get to it. There's a note that I need, and I don't have it. Whether that be an open string to use as a drone, and all I need to do here is I just need to take that third string G and drop it to F sharp, and I have the note that I want. So, or I just need to drop that second string from B to A, and that's all I need here. So I went through a process of exploring tunings in that way, instead of starting with the tuning first, if you like. So that those were kind of some of my approaches to alternate tunings in recent years, for sure. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And I kind of inferred from what you were saying there that to a certain extent, you want to avoid the tuning just becoming an other collection of patterns and shapes. You want the tuning to kind of be in service of what you're trying to create. Is that a fair analysis?
Yeah, that's a very fair analysis. Sometimes the tunings can be really inspiring. They can kind of like suggest music that you would otherwise not ever kind of stumbled upon otherwise, which is great. But again, yes, they can. Once you get used to another tuning and you get these shapes, then again you can start relying on them. And in the composition process, the guitar should be inspiring, and the tuning should be inspiring, but it shouldn't become like a dictator, right? It shouldn't become a situation where it says, "Oh, well, this works, so rely on that again." So sometimes it's quite nice to push yourself slightly out of those comfort zones just to get you thinking a little bit fresher about what you can bring to compositions. And obviously learning repertoire by other players who have used alternate tunings is a wonderful thing to do, because that you'll go like, oh, okay, so that's how they're approaching this tuning. I can see how they've got this kind of voicing here, and I haven't really thought about that before. or they're using this kind of bass drone in this way, or whatever it might be. Yeah, I do enjoy. I love learning other people's music. I do it all the time, and particularly in the alternate tuning realm, I think it can be a very valuable thing to do for sure.
And may I ask, for the benefit of those watching, let's say someone is really interested in what you've just said and is thinking, well, I'd like to start trying that out myself. When you start with an alternate tuning, where do you initially begin? So, for example, do you start thinking, well, okay, so is it a very cerebral thing where you're kind of thinking, well, this is what this chord would be, this is what this chord would be, oh, that would be the scale, and now we can work with that? Or does it tend to be that the sound of the tuning itself leads you, so you're kind of ear led rather than head led?
Yeah, I think it. I mean, it could be a little bit of both, depending on what kind of musician you are and how you work. I guess so. Like some musicians are quite comfortable in that kind of a little bit more of a theory-based approach to things. Like you say, you go into an alternate tuning and you figure out your chords around that and do it in a quite a cerebral way. That's one way to do it. I relatively rarely go down that route, to be honest. I will trust my gut a lot, and I'll go with what my ear is telling me with these tunings and just explore for fun. And maybe the theory will come maybe next. But I just enjoy exploring the sounds that these alternate tunings can bring to the instrument in a very free and easy way, like not being afraid to make some terrible noises in the process, but like just exploring for the sake of for the fun of it, and then yeah, go back and think, okay, well, this sounds great. I'm really enjoying this. Why? Let's see what I've actually done here. Because I transcribe a lot, and a lot of my theoretical knowledge has come from kind of teaching myself how to transcribe music, I suppose, both with my own stuff and other people's stuff. I do enjoy that process of discovering something cool and creating something around it, and then at a later point going, okay, well, what have I actually done here? Let's really understand it. Let's pick it apart. Let's put it on the page and see it. And that can be really, really fascinating. But yeah, if for someone who's just trying to get their foot in the door in the realm of alternate tunings, again, starting simple is never a bad thing. And if you've been listening to music or you have a guitarist who uses alternate tunings, see if they have any repertoire that is within range that you'd be happy to dip into, and just start picking through some tunes and seeing how they do things. I mean, the repertoire and alternate tunings over the last like 10-15 years has just exploded. So any alternate tuning will have a wealth of resources online and a wealth of players using them. But I mean, it's not a bad idea just to start simple with like just a good old bit of drop D, just getting used to that kind of like lower bass, the double bass string drone vibe, and then you could then take it to the next step and go into dadgad. And obviously dadgad is a almost like a world of its own. In fact, dadgad is like it's almost a genre in its own right at this point. But I remember having a conversation with someone at I think it was a guitar show or something. I was like, oh, what kind of music do you listen to? What kind of genres or whatever? And he was like, yeah, I listen to dadgad. It was like it's become elevated beyond a humble tuning, and it is now a genre. It's quite funny.
That's wonderful advice, Will. Thank you. Well, some of the things you were saying there kind of lead me on to another aspect of your musicianship that we've kind of touched on already, but I'd like to really dive into it now. One thing I've always loved about your music is, so how can I put this? I'm going to gush if I'm not careful. This there's so much melody in everything you do, well.
Mhm.
Even when it's quite, technically difficult, very sophisticated arrangements, the melodies are so beautiful and simple, you can pretty much sing them back after one listen. Now, that's a really beautiful thing, and I think that's why your music resonates with so many people. But I'd like to know how that came to be. Is that something that you've consciously thought about and worked on, or is it more something that kind of came out naturally within your wider musical voice?
I think it's something that developed over time. It's not something that my first piece of music wasn't like a lovely melody necessarily or anything like that. And it took me a long time of developing my own kind of compositional voice to realize that melody was something that I found to be very important and resonated with me. I love what a melody can do. I think it's an amazing thing. Like I have like an interest in design as well, and for me, like a melody can is like a line drawing, and so some of the best designs you could recognize from just a single line drawing, and you'd go, ah, yes, that's whatever it might be. Just like great designs are can be kind of boiled down to their essence of themselves in that way. In the same way as a piece of music, if you boil it all down, strip everything away, and you're left with just that line drawing, that melody, it can still be immensely powerful and connect in a very human way with people. But that took time. It took me time to kind of realize that was going to be a big part of my own music. But there were also kind of moments within my journey that kind of I don't know, it got me thinking that melody was the thing to dig into and was did need importance. And a couple of things. I mean, one was the fact that my dad was a musician himself, and he would often talk to me about the importance of a good tune. So that was kind of bubbling away in the back of my mind somewhere. And then I also had this interesting kind of thing happen, which is even surreal to think about now, even. But back in the days when I first started writing, I would also record myself in a very, very basic way. I think it was literally like take the jack from my guitar and get a converter into the microphone jack from my desktop computer, just plug it straight in, like absolutely brutal kind of recording process. But I just did it because I enjoyed that process of kind of recording my stuff. And I'd have these kind of like CDs of like 2 or 3 tracks that I'd like palm off to family members and that kind of thing. And then I went to a gig in my local town at the time, Wimborne Minster, at the venue there, at the Tivoli Theatre. And the gig was of 2 guitarists, Andy McKee and Tommy Emmanuel. They were doing like a double header. And after the gig, I did the wonderful kind of teenage thing of like going up to the CD stand at the end of the gig with this CD, and I gave a copy to them, right, to Tommy and Andy, expecting absolutely nothing whatsoever, because these are very, very busy people who are touring all over the place. They probably get handed music all the time, and I was very, very expectant of the fact that it would just end up in a bin backstage, and that was fine. But I did it, and it had my phone number on it, in the kind of vain hope that they might be bothered to listen, and they might bother to get in touch about it. I had my phone number and email address or whatever it might have been. The following day, on my way to school, I was being driven to school by mum or dad, I can't quite remember, and I got a phone call to my mobile phone, and it was Tommy Emmanuel on the phone, and he had bothered to listen to the CD, and he had bothered to phone me up. And I at the time, look, I was so taken aback by it, I didn't even know what to say. I was kind of fairly stunned. My memory of it is sketchy, but it was something like, "Hey, Will, it's Tommy here." And I was like, what? It's like, yeah, I've listened to the CD, like the word, but I think that you should really focus in on the melodies, and that has always stuck with me. It was a very brief conversation, not least because I wasn't giving anything back to him because I was just so stunned by it all. But he definitely said to me, you should really focus on the melody. And it stuck with me. And though all of those kind of influences kind of like bubbled away. And then as I started composing more and I started recording myself more, and I started to listen to myself more, and that was a massive kind of sea change for me. It's like I started listening to my music more, which is a silly thing, right? You just think, oh, you listen to your music all the time, you're the one writing it. But no, I was playing it. I wasn't listening to it. And the two things are very, very different. And I was playing these pieces and I was like, yeah, this is great. I'm having fun here. Then I'd record them and I'd listen to it and I go to myself, I am not enjoying listening to this piece of music. And that is a problem. Like I'm enjoying playing it, but I'm not enjoying listening to it. And I was like, why is that? And it's all about the melody. So I didn't have anything I was latching onto there. Musically, for me, I was wanting to hear that melody. And over a period of a good few years, that just started becoming a more and more important part of the music I was creating. The melody, and yeah, singing, being able to sing that tune and making sure that it could hold its own on its own. Stripping it back to that line drawing idea again. That's been a big part of how I've thought about my own compositions for sure.
There's some wonderful stories there, Will. Thank you for sharing them with
Yeah, no
us.
worries, man.
There's a couple of things I wanted to say in relation to all that. Firstly, I love that analysis of the line drawing, and then you can shade out and work from there. I remember it must be about 3 or 4 years ago now. I was out in Spain, and I was up near Ronda, and I was on this coach trip, and I had one of your albums on, and this track came on. I think it was Blindsided,
Hmm.
and I just had that on loop for about an hour, and
Oh
I
wow.
just, I just loved how you just kept reworking that melody, but kept coming back to it.
Hmm.
There was it. It was very simple, exceptionally strong, and I think often people confuse simple and easy.
Yes.
I was listening to that and I thought that's very simple, but my
Hmm.
God, that's not easy to do.
Hmm.
And,
Hmm.
and and certainly not to that level of refinement. So I love your melodies for that reason, the way they can evolve.
Oh, thanks, Samuel. I appreciate that. I'm glad you like them, man.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And the other question I've got relating to that, have you been in touch with Tommy since? Because if you haven't, you really should.
Yeah, no, no, I haven't. Genuinely, it's one of those things where you think that our paths probably would have crossed at some gig or festival so far, but they really haven't. I mean, it's one of those degrees of separation thing, isn't it? Like, there's not many degrees of separation in the musical world, and obviously, a lot of my friends and colleagues work with Tommy, very, very frequently. If I do kind of see him again, and I'm sure I will do at some point. I would certainly like to hope I would. I would definitely share that story. I mean, thoroughly doubt that he will remember it because he does more gigs than anyone on this earth, and will speak to more kind of hopeful teenage guitarists than many other people would ever. But what I really loved about it is it just was that lovely little kind of moment of kindness from him to reach out to someone at that stage in life. And for him, you know, it's a relatively small thing to do, right? Like it's a phone call for like a minute or two. And then he's off to the next gig and busy, busy, busy. But for me, it's a memory that I'll have for the rest of my life. And I think that that is something that I've been aware of, not just because of the fact that that moment meant quite a lot and how it kind of certainly felt like it did have an impact. But also, now that I am a professional myself and I'm working with students and I'm seeing people in gigs, you kind of think to yourself, well, it's a nice thing to be able to try and pass that on. It's one of those things where the torch constantly gets passed from one person to the next. So I'm hope I always do my best to try and be as giving as I can with like my time and responses to people because you never know. You never know what one word, what one phrase might do to someone's outlook and how inspiring it could potentially be. So yeah, I do. Yeah, I would certainly hope to see Tommy again at some point. That would be great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this kind of leads me quite nicely to where I wanted to go next because we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to just drill into it a bit more. Having listened to a lot of your music over the years, one thing that really strikes me about it is certainly with many of your more recent albums, I find a lot of the time instrumental music, people get very focused on demonstrating their technical facility.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of get the impression that for you, technique is very much in service of the music as opposed to the other way around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's unpack that. How do you get the balance right?
Yeah, it is tricky. And I think that kind of is a good example of how my compositions have and my approach to them has developed right over the years. As I mentioned earlier, that when I was talking about the four hats idea and like the guitarist thing was right at the top and the artist thing with everything else was below, that was an example of where I was at a time where technique was a bit of a focus. And I think that there's a maturity thing that comes with it maybe as well, when you're younger and you just want to kind of show off a bit and you're just trying to be flash. As a result of that, you get quite good, so that's, a benefit from it. But as I said, I recorded myself, I listened to myself, and I was like, well, that's not doing it for me because it is too technique focused. So how do we find the balance then between technique and music? So I guess the approach to me is, just making sure you never lose sight of what the music is trying to do. Like, what is your intention here? There's nothing wrong with, creating music which is technically incredibly demanding or, very impressive in whatever way, as long as it is serving the music. So recording yourself and listening to yourself back has always been a big part of, I think it can be such a valuable part of a practice routine, whether it's composition focused or not. But certainly when you are composing, I do think that having that ability to take an objective step back is very valuable. Some people find it very difficult, recording yourself and listening to yourself back. At first, it's one of those things where sometimes, if you, I don't know, you hear your own voice back on a recording or on an answering machine or something, you think, oh, is that what I sound like? Oh my God. It's like you have to kind of get over that initial kind of hump of like, oh, maybe there's a little bit of uneasiness coming with listening to yourself. But once you get over that and you can kind of train yourself to become a very, very good listener to your own work, and you can think to yourself, right, okay, what's happening here? Am I enjoying the noise that I'm creating? Am I enjoying the sounds that are coming out of the instrument here? Is the music getting lost because I'm focusing too much on technique? Those were all questions that I was asking myself, certainly when I was having this bit of a kind of change in direction in terms of how I was kind of approaching composition. And now, it's all about the music for me, and the technique is always kind of secondary. And I've spent a long time over the recent years really digging in to the quality of sound that I create when I'm playing the guitar and I'm composing. Like, it's such a big part of what I do now. And that has come because I have recorded myself and listened to myself back. Not always an easy process, can be painful sometimes, but it's massively valuable for sure.
There's some very wise words there. Thank you, Will.
No worries.
Now, I'd now like to put a question to you that I ask all my guests, because it's a great way to get a sense of their, for want of a better phrase, their kind of wider philosophy on music.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fair to say that anyone who's ever picked up an instrument and tried to learn it has at some point, well, I hope they have anyway, aspired to be a good musician.
Mm-hmm.
But to hit a target, you kind of have to be able to see what the target is. So we have to be really specific with our language. With this in mind, Will, what does it mean to you to be a good musician?
It's the big question, isn't it? It's the big question. And it is a challenging question to answer, really, not least because music can take so many different forms and there's so many different approaches to it. If I was going to say, like, what is a good musician in general, I think that the ability to listen is a key part of that for me. And I think that being able to truly listen to what's going on, whether it's your own playing or someone else's playing, appreciate it, understand it, is a lovely thing to be able to do, and can certainly develop, broader musicianship across the board. But that thing you touched on there within the question is key to this whole debate, I think. It's like you have to define what it is to you. Like, it is a very, very personal thing, the musical journey. And I think that even harking back to the conversation we had earlier, like the student that I had, was going down the composition route, decided it wasn't for him. That's his musical journey. So for him, being a composer is not necessarily part of being a good musician, because it's not for him. And that's absolutely fine. I don't think you need to be able to do everything in order to be a good musician. What you need to be able to do, I think, is to decide what it is that you want to get from music and take steps to achieve those goals in an like an enjoyable and healthy way. And if you can do that, then I think that you should end up hopefully with a life that has been enriched by your experiences in music. I think there can be sometimes too much stress for people to say, oh, I should be doing this. I think I need to be doing this in order to be a good musician. And, there are some certain key skills within, being a musician, of course. You don't have to be able to do everything. And I think there are areas where if you are thinking, oh, I need to be doing this, but I really don't enjoy it, but I think I should. I'm being told that I should, but I don't enjoy it. Then I think maybe you shouldn't. Like maybe that isn't maybe that's not part of the equation of being a good musician for you. Um, so yeah, that's what I would probably say in answer to it is being able to define it for your individual self and then work from there is a lovely position to be in, for sure.
I think those are very wise words, and what's been very striking as I've done this series, I've talked to some of my favourite musicians, some of the best musicians in the world. Not one person has given the same answer.
Yeah, great. Yeah,
It's
as it should be, as
as
it
it
should
should
be.
be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you, Well. We've now come to a point in the discussion I've really been looking forward to. Whenever I do talking music discussions, I often say, from a health point of view, to a certain extent, you are what you eat. From a musical point of view, to a certain extent, you are what you listen to.
Hmm.
So let's unpack this a little bit with you, Will. This is a hard question because what you have to leave out is often more
Yeah.
difficult than what you put in. But if you had to, what would you say are your top 5 guitar albums and why have you chosen them?
Yeah, it is. It's a killer question, isn't it? It's like the desert island discs part of the equation, isn't it? It's hard to kind of pick and choose. And the approach I've gone with this question is to think about albums that have had like a particular influence on me as a player and a composer. Um, so because if I was going down the route of albums that I enjoy listening to, it would be impossible because there's obviously too many. So albums that have had a key impact on me really at phases of my life, particularly my development as a player and as a composer. That's what I've kind of gone with here. So starting out, then I suppose we'll have to begin with a Forcioni album, and it's the one that he was kind of touring around when I first saw him, I suppose, playing a lot of tracks from, and that's the album Touch Wood, which it kind of like I listened to that album so much following the first gigs that I saw of his, and it was just reinforcing all of those things that I'd seen in those gigs. The idea of what this guitar can do was miraculous. The different styles, the different kind of world influences, the techniques, the soundscapes, the everything was all contained in that album for me, and it was a big influence in terms of getting me excited to create music on the guitar. And actually, it was a lovely question that you posed here, Samuel, because it did get me to think, and I was able to kind of dip back into some of these albums again, even though a couple of them I haven't listened to for a while, and I loved it. It was so nice having the excuse to dip back into them. So yeah, Touchwood will always bring back some lovely, lovely memories of those early days of being inspired to create music. So that's Touchwood by Antonio Forcioni. Now, another player that we haven't really mentioned yet, but as another massive influence on me is Clive Carroll. He was the guy who managed to kind of make that kind of transition from classical to acoustic and marry the two worlds, right? And I saw Clive not all that long after seeing Antonio. It was kind of when that world had been open to me, then he was another name that kind of was popping up because he was a very active gigging around at that time. And at that stage of my life, he was gigging around and touring along a lot with John Renbourn, who was obviously part of that whole, the whole story of the steel string guitar in this country, particularly, And Clive's album Life in Color was one that I've listened to more than most, because the thing about that album that I really connected with was going into that idea of quality of sound from the guitar, the expressiveness of the instrument, the kind of classical influence on steel string technique. Very, very different to Antonio in many respects, but similar in the sense that it got me excited to create and record and try and find a sound that was my own. Because you listen to Antonio, it's like, that's Antonio. You listen to Clive, and that's Clive. And I didn't want to go, I never was like, oh, I want to, be an Antonio wannabe. I don't want to become another Antonio. I don't want to become another Clive. But what they have managed to do in order, like creating their own musical world, that's the thing that I would love to aspire to, is that kind of ability to create my own world of music. So Life in Colour by Clive Carroll was certainly an album that factored into that story. Riddle by Thomas Lieb. That certainly was the album when I was particularly into the percussive side of the steel string guitar. Thomas was a big influence of mine. I received some tuition from Thomas at the IGF summer school events when I was younger, when I was in my teens again, and I found Thomas's approach, his playing, his kind of absolute domination of the guitar, like technically, I just found it very, very addictive. And that album Riddle and some of the tracks on it, I remember listening to that album. I had like a Saturday job as a cleaner at a B&B near where I used to live, and to make the cleaning bearable, that I would be listening to that album Riddle like on repeat. And there was just tracks within that which I found very, very inspiring in that journey, that very rhythm-based stuff, but also, some beautiful melodies in there, some beautiful textures. Like when there's one track on there, Acasquero, by him, which was, I still play that tune today and get a huge amount of enjoyment out of it. So, Riddle by Thomas Lieb had to be in there because, again, it just memories associated with it at a particular point in my life, which kind of it was influential for sure. A more recent album is an album by the South African guitarist Derek Gripper. It's an album called One Night on Earth. And Derek is an amazing player. And what he's kind of done, he's made a name for himself in arranging Malian kora music for the classical guitar. I first met Derek at the Harare International Festival of Arts over in Zimbabwe a number of years ago. And that's when I first became aware of his work and this album, One Night on Earth. And I just love it. I keep on coming back to it, not just because it's musically wonderful and hearing these pieces on guitar, it's just strangely addictive, but the actual recording itself, the production of it is beautiful. The atmosphere of it, the fact you can hear the nature around him as he's playing. Oh, it's very rich. It's a very, very rich recording that I just find, I keep on coming back to it. I find it very, very addictive and very, very unique. So One Night on Earth by Derek Gripper, definitely in there. And finally, I had to get something in here which harks to the music of South America, because South American guitar music has been a big part of my guitar journey ever since learning through the classical grades and always really connecting and enjoying the South American pieces within those syllabuses, because it was always something about the rhythms that I just found completely addictive and a joy to play. And if I had to pick one style of music to play for the rest of my life, if I couldn't play anything else, it would be music from South America, hands down. It just brings such joy. And this album is one by Luis Bonfa, Solo in Rio 1959. And it's a collection of tunes. It's a lot of tracks. I mean, there's something like 25 tracks on it. It's a collection of recordings that Smithsonian put together and released. And they are wonderful stuff. I mean, like Luis Bonfa's music I was introduced to by Clive Carroll, funnily enough, with a piece that he transcribed, Uma Preche, and that kind of opened my eyes and ears to this Solo in Rio 1959 album. And it just encapsulates everything that I love about South American guitar. You've got the wonderfully rich chord voicings, which have such depth and intrigue to all of them. Beautiful melodies, singing as if they're being sung by a singer, um, all wrapped up in that kind of rhythm that you can't help but hear, and a smile comes to your face, and you can't help but hear, and you start moving. And what he can do with his guitar, Louis Bonfo, in these recordings and the pieces that he's created here, is just fantastic. I love playing his music. I love listening to his music. So Solo in Rio 1959 by Louis Bonfo is the fifth and final choice.
There's some very fine choices there, my friend. And I'd highly recommend all those watching and listening, after you've finished enjoying this, go and check those out because there's some very fine music on all of those albums.
Yeah, please do. It is a yeah, it's some cracking stuff on those.
I've been weighing up whether or not to ask this one, because it's a bit of a hypothetical and a kind of counterfactual history sort of one.
Okay.
Let's say you're at the start of your musical journey again, but you're not handed a guitar. That's not an option.
Hmm.
What instrument would you choose?
Ooh, yeah. Interesting one. Oh my goodness. I the very first response is piano. That's the very first response I give, like almost by default. It's like I just love the piano. Um, it is similar to the guitar in its multi-textured loveliness, you know. But I have to say that there's some. I've always been quite attracted to the idea of playing an instrument that is so different from my experience of guitar. You know, just so different. Like I would love, for example, to have the opportunity to learn to a very, very high standard something like jazz trumpet, because yeah, I love the sound and the whole way of being a trumpeter. Just it's such a different thing to the guitar. You know how you create the sound and all of that stuff would be really, really fun. So it's difficult. If I had to choose, I think I'd have to go piano, but there's a big part of me that would go, you know what? Let's go trumpet.
I think that's a good call. I think that's a very good call, and I know what you mean. Jazz trumpet. If I listen to the music of Freddie Hubbard, Winter
Mm.
Marsalis, any of those great jazz trumpet players, it just blows me away
Yeah, man. I
every
mean, hell
time.
yeah. It's just, yeah, there's something quite addictive about the idea of being able to do that kind of thing, you know? But so yeah, another lifetime trumpet would be cool.
Well, my friend, I really appreciate you coming on the show and having this discussion with me today. We're pretty much at the end of the interview now,
Hmm.
but before I put my final question to you, if people have enjoyed listening to what you've had to say today and would like to go online and find out more about you and where you're playing, where's the best place to go?
Probably just my website, to be honest, which is willmcnicol.co.uk, because that links to everything else that I have going on in terms of social media. Um, and if you're interested in my approaches to playing and more of the learning aspect of it, I have an online learning platform up there called The College, which you can look about, and things like the four hats that I alluded to earlier on are gone into in a lot more depth over there. So yeah, willmcnicol.co.uk would be the place to go.
I'd like to finish with a question I always close with. Hindsight is an amazing thing.
Hmm.
Let's say you could go back in time and offer your younger self, the young musician Will McNicol, one piece of advice. What would it be?
I think it would probably be something like make the most of what you have. I think that'd probably be where I'd go because in my experience, I've been all too keen to move to the next thing, get distracted by the shiny new thing all the time in music rather than trying to really appreciate and make the most of what I've already got, if that makes sense. And I'm trying to address that balance at the moment. I mean, it's a fairly good just bit of life advice as well, right? Make the most of what you have, appreciate what you've got, and I think that the same can certainly be applied to music. So that would probably be what I would tell myself from a young age.
Very wise words to end on. And with that, Will McNicol, thank you for coming on the show and talking music.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It's been an absolute pleasure, my friend.